Bonjour, je crois que voilà, nous pouvons commencer cette discussion. Hello everybody and thank you for joining us for this 42 Sussex Rendez-vous. Chère Margaret Atwood, c'est un immense plaisir de vous avoir parmi nous aujourd'hui pour inaugurer ce rendez-vous 42 Sussex. C'est un rendez-vous que nous avons d'habitude physiquement, mais aujourd'hui en ligne, malheureusement. Je sais que vous maîtrisez parfaitement le français, mais pour notre audience, je vais passer à l'anglais. So it is an immense honor, dear Margaret, to have you with us. And thank you really for accepting right away my invitation to celebrate International Women's Day, or I would say International Women Week. Because your work have transcended genders, times, and borders, I couldn't think of anyone else for having this conversation today about the biggest challenges that we are facing. Women's rights, of course, climate disruption, global power, democracy, and of course, COVID-19. I don't need to present
N'avez
you.
pas besoin de vous présenter.
Everybody knows
Tout le
you,
monde vous
especially
connaît.
in Canada. You won twice the Booker Prize, and your poems and books are known all over the world. Your work is also accessible through movies and series, and you are very well known. One of your best friends told me yesterday, she was talking about you, uh, Peggy, because I think that's it's your little name. She is an astonishing writer and a magnificent person. Maybe it is sometimes a little bit more difficult to characterize the kind of writer you are. You are obviously, for a multitude of people from several generations, the contemporary spokesperson against the failures of non-egalitarian systems. You are also, for sure, a birds watcher and an environment activist. Indigenous people, nature, animals are at the center of many of your poems, and Dearly, your last book, is also about absence and endings. You are certainly also a feminist, even if you point out that there are 75 different types of feminists and that women are not angels. And with Penelope, Offred, or Ren and Toby, the two survivors of the year of the flood, you have never ceased to give women a voice. You defend yourself from being a science fiction writer, even if in the year of the flood, you present an apocalyptic vision of the world after a man-made plague, and we don't want to see any resemblance with something that we are experiences. And you also address the subject of genetic and pharmaceutical modification in Oryx and Crake. You prefer the word speculative fiction or social science fiction to describe The Handmaid's Tale, and you explain that you don't put in your books anything that somebody somewhere hasn't really done. We'll go through all these themes during the next hour with a great expert in empowerment, digital citizenship, and power at large, a strong female voice, Bianca Willie, whom you know and respect. As the first female French ambassador to Canada, and as a truly admirer of your work, and I must confess that you probably have been my best companion during the first lockdown, because it took me a few weeks to read Mad Adam, the 3 books. Chère Margaret Atwood, je vous remercie à nouveau pour votre présence. C'est un grand honneur et nous sommes ravis. Je vous passe la parole. Bianca, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you, Margaret, for the opportunity to have this conversation today. Um, what a wild time it is. They're surreal times. And I'd have to start to say that sometimes people are pretending like things are normal, I think, when they just begin a conversation. And so I think we're all a bit ragged, and some of us grieving and some of us angry. And I think it's a really nice opportunity to think about what to do with some of those feelings and also some of the spare time and the hope. So maybe three quick things before we get into the many things that I know we'd like to talk about. I think the first thing is, for anyone watching, I would suggest you might grab a pen and paper, because there might be book recommendations flying out of this discussion, given that we're going to touch on things we can't get into their depths. Secondly, we will talk about women, democracy, power, and leadership, but we're not going to do those things in abstract terms. We feel it's really important to land these things practically. How do we implement issues related to these things? How do we operationalize our power and our collective leadership? So that's that piece. And which brings me to the third piece, the context we're in right now. We're in a pandemic. We have had some time to reflect on things that have been going on for a while. We're also in an increasingly terrifying climate crisis. And so those are the contexts through which we'd like to speak of these themes. And I say all of that because I believe we're going to have a winding road. So have sort of said that up front, and hopefully we all enjoy that walk together. And so, Margaret, perhaps to start, I think part of the conversation in this moment is, how did we get here? How are we actively and passively participating in our democracies, in capitalism, in white supremacy, particularly Western North America? How do we look at those choices and think, what can we do differently? You know, what are different models? What are different things we can think about in terms of different models for sharing and stewardship? And I think a nice place to start to think about how that all points to climate is birds. So in this pandemic, for those of us who are not on the front lines and perhaps are not essential workers, there has been an increase in bird watching, which is an interesting, uptick. And as I understand, one of your last trips, perhaps before this pandemic began, was to Tasmania in Australia, and you were in search of a parrot. And I was hoping you could give us a little more on that story, perhaps, and how these things tie together to help us understand what's happening with the climate.
All right, birds. Uh, Merci, Madame l'ambassadrice. C'est tellement un grand plaisir pour moi et aussi un honneur d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. That's my awful French accent. Oh well. Uh, so, birds. BirdLife International is the oldest and largest environmental organization in the world. It's got 120 approx member countries, and it is a ground up organization. That is, it's the people in those countries on the ground in the situations who tell us what is happening, and if they need help, then they reach out to BirdLife Central, which is in England. And that's what you need in conservation. That's what you need in environmental care, and that's why we say that um, Indigenous people on the land are key to this whole effort. But so are other people living on the land. So you get your information from people who are there and can observe. So why birds? Birds fly from here to there, migrating birds. And they give you an overview of what's happening on the planet in a way that um, other life forms don't particularly, although if you tracked whales, you might get some idea too. Animals that migrate. So animals that migrate depend on good conditions along um, the whole pathway that they are taking. So you may have a wonderful backyard bird feeder. That's not going to help if the species that you think is going to turn up for your backyard bird feeder has had to migrate over a toxic environment and has got killed. So it does give us an overview, and that's why birds. But it also gives us an overview of the fact that every life form is dependent on other life forms, and that includes us. So a planet in which everything was dead except us would be impossible.
And I think there's a theme in here about interconnectedness clearly, and having to understand systems, some pieces of which you can't see. And I think in terms of the pandemic, needing to share air and suddenly being unable to in new and very clear ways might be bringing this lesson, perhaps more viscerally to all of us in terms of the interconnectedness. In terms of same thing, interconnectedness and systems. I was watching a video where you were presenting the 2020 Equator Initiative Prize to the Nishuli Maasai Conservancy. And my ears pricked up when I was listening to you for several reasons, including how the work there might be a blueprint for different types of systems. We're talking about what else can we do and what can we do differently. And the one term in particular was when you mentioned the commons, because Eleanor Ostrom's work, Nobel Prize winning economist, on how do we better share our resources, whether it's waters, forests, felt like it was a piece of this. And so I'm really curious to hear a bit more about that model and how the stewardship and that sort of collective leadership is something that we can look to and hopefully learn from.
Well, this has been an amazing organization. It's the National Maasai Conservancy. It's not all of the Maasai people. There are others around that area, but this is where this model started, and others are now adopting it because it has been so successful. So what they did was, um, instead of following the, let us say, 18th, 19th, 20th century model of closing land off with fences and walls, they took down the fences. And that meant that wildlife voted with its feet. It decided where to go, not being stopped by fences. And since they're herders, they had to establish a kitty in case a lion did happen to eat their goat. They had to have a way of replacing that goat. You couldn't have one family or group of people suffering um, because the lion chose their goat. So they also paid the traditional landowners um, lease money for having this opened up. And the result has been that the births amongst, so giraffes, elephants, lions, etc., just went up like this. So the animals were choosing. And it's been very successful. But the other part of it is that when COVID hit, because of their community organization that they already had put in place, they were able to very efficiently distribute food to not only to their community but to their neighbors. So um, the markets that they normally would have gone to got closed down, of course, because of the COVID. So they had to think of workarounds, but they did that. And now other communities are coming to them and saying, how can we do this too? So empowering people on the ground. And the other part of this is the emphasis put on girls and women that they're also doing. So empowering people on the ground, sharing decision making, looking at ways to do things differently, taking down the fences, opening it up. Everyone said, of course, at first, that will never work. Lions will eat all your items. But that didn't happen. So it's been very, very interesting. And there are other models like that that we are looking at. One of them is intensive grazing by herd animals. The old model was, intensive grazing is bad, grazing is bad, make those people go away with their herd animals. Apparently, if you do it right, it increases the fertility of the land and stops desertification. Okay, stops land turning into desert, drying up. So that's another thing to look at.
So
anyway, people are doing this all over the world. They're looking at ways in which things had been done, not working well, and thinking of other, better ways to do them. And while we're at it, we've got to stop bottom dragging the ocean. Sorry.
good. Throw these in as often as they come up. Because I think when you talk about taking the fences down, so much of what feels difficult with capitalism, growth, and issues with climate and capitalism, like it's really hard for me to look at our record with democracy and capitalism and feel confident about where we're going next with it, in terms of addressing the climate crisis. So these models that shift to a different, stewardship and a sharing and a rethinking, because I think this idea that private property is an invention. And I think there's, right, like, I don't know, this idea.
Is an invention. Money is an invention. Laws are inventions. These are all things that human beings have decided upon. And if they have decided upon this way of running things, they can also decide upon another way. It's not a law of nature. It is stuff that we made up. And if you studied the 19th century, once upon a time I was a Victorianist, you can see people struggling with capitalism then. I mean, they really didn't understand it. They didn't understand why there were boom and bust cycles, and you have novels in which somebody loses everything and you can't really figure out why. But even the big proponents of it in the 19th century said if you don't have checks and balances on it, the result is a desert. It gobbles up everything. There's nothing built into it that says renewable. It's just make a lot of quick bucks now. Um, and if we keep on operating that way, we will have a desert. And my question in that case is, do you really want to be a species on this planet? And that is what we have to ask ourselves. The cockroaches will be fine. And I'll
Yeah.
them.
Well, I read a quote, extinction is a choice, and it really feels like that's the choice many people are making right now. And I think, again, like,
They're making it. Yeah. So you said in your opening address, how did we get here? Well, we got here because people before us made decisions. And you can follow the string of decisions back to before when that decision was made, and you can watch them making those decisions. You can see why they made them, and you can then see where those decisions went wrong.
and in terms of, the words that are used to describe our histories, I struggle a lot reading linear history. I do better with stories. I feel like I can understand times better when they're written that way. And I want to share a quote because I think it'll help us tie words and writing also to what else can we do from here? Because we really do want to keep trying to think how can we act differently this afternoon and tomorrow morning. So I did want to share this quote because I think you were, gesturing at it with words that are in here. 2014, Ursula K. Le Guin at the National Book Awards. Uh, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. And I hear a lot of this, that we need to imagine different futures, alternative futures. And I think these things we're talking about with stewardship and sharing better and trust models, how can we share things within trust? It's moving that idea because I fear we have lots of ideas. It's the implementation where we're falling down. And I do think there's a lot of inspiration in art, but how do people take it upon themselves to make it into their small bites every day? What is my step? What is the thing I can do? And I think in North American politics, at least, and probably more broadly globally, the idea of a Green New Deal is one of the sort of ways to package some of what, I don't know, what might look like more traditional democratic policy. But then there's this little issue of all this wealth being concentrated at the top right now. And not a little issue at all. But with these themes here, Green New Deal and the sort of wealth concentration and us looking at these different systems, I'm curious, does that provoke any reaction from you in terms of, there are those things sitting there. Here we go. Are we just going to replicate the past again with sort of greenwashing, clean technologies?
We cannot continue going in the direction of top of the pyramid accumulation of wealth. There's a cutoff point for that. You cannot keep doing that without encountering, for instance, either widespread famine or the French Revolution. And one of the lessons of the French Revolution, if you go back and read it, it was a lot slower than we think. We think of it as this sort of sudden event, but it was rolling. It's like watching a snowball roll downhill, and people could have corrected course at a number of different points, but they couldn't get their head around how they had to change. Couldn't get their head around it. They wanted, and we are a conservative species. All animal species are conservative. We fish didn't learn to walk because they wanted to. They were forced to. So we like things staying the same because we're used to it. Because we're used to it, we think that's the way things are. And when things change, it makes us very nervous because we don't know what the new rules are at all. Um, so top accumulation of wealth with everything up at the top, that it can't keep going in that direction. There has to be a more horizontal movement, and a Green New Deal would accomplish that in the same way that FDR's New Deal accomplished it during the Depression. It was a way of spreading wealth out um, more horizontally. So, yes, they did public works, but the kinds of public works that they did are not going to be as crucial as the kinds of things that a Green New Deal could do. Again,
Right.
we return to the question, do we want to be a species? So if we want to be a species, we have to do something like that, and we have to make it worth the while of those further down the pyramid, because otherwise they will say, what is this doing for me? So it's the same idea as BirdLife being a ground up organization. And unless you're making it worth the while of the people who actually live there and are in the situation, they're not going to do it, because why should they?
And I think to this suggestion of, policy, I think, yes, there's some things that can be accomplished through formal democratic policy, right? But then there's also been and always has been this sort of mutual aid, people coming together, working together and collectively caring for each other where the state has failed. And I mean, the state has failed people ever since, it existed. I think that that is an interesting place of sort of a less formal, but also, a less formal way to do politics, but it relies on something that I'm a little fearful of again in this moment, which is people looking to individual leadership all the time. And I don't think we're great at understanding that. And I think women are in some ways historically better at collective leadership and investing in each other and building capacity in each other. And so I think there's something there as well, about how things have to shift. Yes, you can participate in your formal politics and the policy, but there's also so much that has to happen on the ground. And I don't know if you've had experience. I think about the Writers' Trust perhaps as one example of a, like, let's go do the thing. Like, it's not happening. Let's go do it ourselves. Do you have anything maybe to share from that
Well,
experience?
you do these kinds of things, and we're talking about the Writers Union and the Writers Trust and PEN Canada, um, stuff that we set up in the 70s and 80s. You do those things because there's a void. The void, you see a need, it is not being filled. You see why that need should be filled, and um, remember what I said about people not wanting to change.
Mm-hmm.
So you then have to get together and do it yourself, because people are not going to do it for you. And um, everyone said the writers union would fail because writers were so weird and contentious, and they were artists. They were all kind of weird. Um, but actually, it seems to have been quite a lot more of a success than certain other kinds of human enterprise, because they had some shared goals, and they were willing to put aside their differences in order to achieve those goals. And that's why we made it a union rather than an association or a a tea party. Um,
Well,
and we did have big fights. We had big fights, and Graham, when raising money for one of these enterprises, the person said to him, "Well, I'm not going to give any money to your organizations because it's full of communists." He says, Graham said, Yeah, we have some communists, but we've got some fascists too. But
And
we
here,
discuss
right?
our individual political preferences. We were there to accomplish what we needed to do for the welfare of our membership.
Right. And this, I think, in this moment, and you wrote this piece in Time about sort of best of times, worst of times, and having some hope in this moment, right? And I think some of the things I've been reflecting on is just in this moment where it's so much clearer to some of us. I'm definitely safer, than people who are working essential jobs or doing, or have always suffered more through the kinds of crises that are occurring now. Um, the need to do this collective caretaking requires an ability to be together and disagree and have hard conversations and get into it, but then decide, okay, like, let's keep talking, we need to figure this out together. And I think this time, I hope people are having that self-reflection and interrogating themselves a bit, because there is time that some of us have right now. Some people don't. Some people have less time just trying to survive. And I think that's a place where, how do we take some of these models and really apply them, because it sounds abstract, right? It's like, well, are people in my neighborhood going to suddenly start sharing their property? Are they going to say, you know what, come on, whoever needs to be safe, please come, come here? Or it's not spontaneously happening. The opportunity is there. But then when you spoke also about the conservancy, you also need to innovate things like insurance, or like different models of how to manage when things go wrong.
What happens
um,
goes wrong, exactly.
yeah. And
We
so I like,
have to start as poverty's nerfect. They do. Well,
yeah,
saying is an act, so it is
yes.
an actual act. But dialing back to the French existentialist, Albert Camus, so it's not who you are, it's what you do. Okay, it's the actions that you take. That's how you should be evaluated. What action did you take? And of course, the people that were interested in that way of looking at things had been through the resistance in France during the war. So it was a question of what actions you had taken. What did you do? What did you actually do? Not what did you say you uh, felt or thought, but
Yeah.
what did you do?
Yeah, and I think in terms of democracy, to your point, because I show up for the political institution all the time. Like, I am one of these, I'll defend the state, and the state has a very violent history, and the state is not functioning well on several fronts. But there has to be, some accountability, and I think accountability is a good way for all of us to think about actions relating to what you say, what you do, and people showing up to participate, and knowing. I think, going back to your time piece about time, like, understanding some of these things are lifetime fights, that you're not going to see the things you might want to see, right? Like that, there's a patience when you're an angry person sometimes.
Well,
Uh,
it's also a forward and a backward. And there is no City of Oz at the end of the Yellow Brick Road. The Yellow Brick Road is not inevitable. There isn't, saying wrong side of history. There isn't a God called history. History can go lots of ways. So, which part of history are you going to be on the wrong side of? Which moment of time are you going to be on the wrong side of it? Because it could change tomorrow. And then that wrong side is going to be seen as the right side. So I don't even think in those terms. I don't think linearly like that. Um, I think that it's much more like the old medieval wheel of fortune, which was a wheel that went around. People at the top fell off and got squashed underneath. Other people came up and got to be at the top, but that wasn't inevitable. There was
mhm.
nothing that said it had to be that way.
Well, I think in your Time magazine piece, you did suggest some things people could do in
Well,
this moment that I think I could argue would be on the right side of history. Actually, a good batch of them in terms of supporting, whether it was restaurants or
yeah,
bookstores
but
or,
you don't do those things because of some abstract thing called history. You do them because they're the right things to do. So you're not going to get a gold star from some history goddess or god. You're doing them because they're the right things to do, because of the values that you have. Not because you're going to get rewarded further down the path,
No,
because you're probably not.
no, but I thought it was a good list. Like, can uh, because I really do think some people think, what should I do today? Is it the performing arts you can support? Is it the bookstore? Is it the local? What's on the other side of the moment we're in? I don't know. Were there any of those that you wanted to, particularly point to?
Those, I'll add some more.
Good.
Why should you buy organic if you can? Why? Because it's much more carbon friendly. If you have living soil, you're sequestering a lot more carbon than if you've got dead soil. So it's not to do with whether it might make you healthier or less healthy, though probably if you eat a lot of chemicals, it's not going to do you a tippity top bunch of good. It's because if farmers were growing organic, a lot more carbon would be sequestered. So, hello, government, you could do that. You could support organic farming and sequester some carbon.
Any other ones you want to call it there? Because these are things people can do. Like, this is what people are looking for. So
yeah, buying organic if you can, cutting down on the plastic. That's a big one, very, very big one. And there are now some schemes whereby you can make building materials and highway materials out of recycled plastic. So we should definitely try to think of something to do about that, because kill the ocean and we're gone. Kill the ocean and there goes 60 to 80% of our oxygen supply, which is made by the oceans. So we really need to pay attention to that. So are you just your shopping practices? Who are you buying from? Where do they grow their stuff? How do they grow their stuff? How are they packaging their stuff? Can you buy from a local market which knows where the things are coming from? Can you support local farming? Can you support local organic farming? These would all be helpful. If everybody did them, wow.
yeah.
So one of the goals should be, let's make that stuff cost the same. Because the only reason people don't do that is that they can't afford it.
So yeah, I'm sitting thinking about all the different kinds of ways people can engage in politics, right? These are all political choices.
Support education for girls and women, and that's on a global scale. And I'm not the only person who said that. A lot of people have said it, that supporting education for girls and women is actually carbon positive. That is, it leads to less carbon being put into the atmosphere. And if you go to a website called Project Drawdown, they've got all of these helpful things and the money numbers and the other numbers having to do with volume. How much carbon would it sequester? How much carbon would not be put into the atmosphere if people did this? Project Drawdown, a very good source for what can I do to be helpful.
Good. So with a couple minutes, and then we're going to have some Q&A. One thing about women's rights that I think a lot about, someone said to me, and it's stuck for a while, probably a lawyer, your rights are only as good as your access to justice.
That's absolutely true.
And so I think that might be a place where we need to think about making sure that administrative justice is something that, I always think about these things. How can you help where, because with technology, it's a lot of the same. Like you can have things buried that no one can follow. And how would you actually address, if something was done to you and no one would even know how to follow the maze. So access to justice, maybe whenever somebody talks about rights, we need to think about access to justice and maybe creating a bit more, more of a path to how to do that kind of work. More of us doing it anyway. I'm just at this point where I don't want to do things I've done before. I want to do new things politically, right? Because I just don't feel that trajectory was good. I'm really glad you talked about nonlinear, though. I think that's a difficult headspace to get into, is understanding nonlinear relations in time.
Back in time. Once upon a time, there were no codex books. Which by codex book, I mean the pages, the spine. Once you have a codex book, you always have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right?
Mhm.
Information linearly. Whereas if you have a bowl with a bunch of scrolls in it, you can read those scrolls in any order. The order is not set. So when the codex book enters the picture and the Bible gets put together, which before the codex book arrives is a bunch of scrolls, somebody had to decide how to arrange those stories. And what do you put at the beginning? What do you put at the end? You didn't have to think about that before there were codex books. So we live in Western civilization. We have a long history of codex books. We're very used to thinking of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And if you're a novelist, you're always doing that, of course. What's going to be the opening? What's in the middle? What's at the end? Of course, life doesn't actually end in those ways. It keeps going. The end isn't arbitrary. It's because you think, well, there's 425 pages. I better polish this off.
This is fascinating to me because the way information is organized too in technology as well, right? Like the sort of systems and
you know, in a different way of presenting, and probably you've been down the rabbit hole lots of times, just like me. You click on something, and then there's something else that you want to that they've got underlined, and you can click on that and find out about that thing, and then you hop back here, and then you go over there. So it's not linear anymore in that way. It may be linear within each little segment, but the information itself is more like what happened when newspapers hit the scene and started including ads. So you'd have a very serious story about, you know, somebody being hit by a train, say, and on the same page, cough drops. So disconnect set in, and that's one of the things James Joyce was zeroing in on, is this, you know, it wasn't a linear presentation in quite the same way anymore. You can tell I went to school up the road from Marshall McLuhan in the late 50s and early 60s, because that's what he was talking about. When the Gutenberg printing press gets invented and codex books become widely available, everybody's thinking changes. We think, oh, isn't it wonderful? All these terrific, great novels could be read by everybody. That's not exactly what happened. What also happened was that a lot of political pamphlets and porn started spewing off those printing presses. Guess what? Internet, anybody? Same kind of thing. But every time there's a new technology that comes on stream, people are mesmerized by it at first. So radio happens. My theory, Hitler wouldn't have been nearly as effective if radio hadn't just hit, because people were hearing this voice. It's like the voice of God coming out of the air into their ears. They were riveted to it. And I can even remember that in my lifetime before television, sitting around the radio. This is the BBC calling North America. Here is the BBC News. The reception wasn't always very good. That's what people did. Television hits. You weren't there, but I can tell you, people had TV dinners on TV trays, and they sat in front of the television set. They were just mesmerized by it. Now it's background noise. You know, people watch TV, but not in the same mystical way. So the internet hits, social media hits, people are just mesmerized by it. There will be an end to that. Something else will happen. People will realize that a lot of this stuff is made up. What can I tell you? Fake news.
probably a good moment to pause and maybe bring some other.
Horrified.
Pardon?
I'm slightly horrified.
No, it's a lot, right? Like the medium, like it's abstract, right? And I think it's
the effects on it in your real life, so it's not so abstract.
Completely, but the spaces to have the conversations where we're reorganizing how we do these things. People are building alternative infrastructures, like it's
talking to you.
And it's all happening. So more just processing as expected here. There's a lot of processing. So I think it's good. It gives me a minute. Ambassador, I don't know if you want to have open with the question, and I'm going to take a look at the other questions that are coming in here and return, but maybe I hand the mic over to you for a moment.
Yes, thank you. I have a question, Margaret. You've said at a gala, I hope that in times all girls may be able to grow up believing that there are no avenue that are close to them simply because they are girls. So my question is, do you think the time is now? And how do you face the main challenges of Canadian women or French women? Because in some of your books, you've touched upon difficult issues like mental health with Alias Grace or bullying in Cat's Eye. In some other books, you portrayed women like survivors. So, what's your view about women in today's society?
Okay, so gender isn't the only differentiator. There are a lot of them, and therefore we can't talk just about women. Just to put a marker female on and say this happens to these people and not to those people. So, how much money have you got? What was your education? Where are you living? What are the conditions of the place that you're living in? What is the attitude of the government towards you of the place that you are living in? And these are all factors, and every individual person is going to be subject to not just girls can't do this and boys can do that. It's not as simple as that. It's that maybe these girls can do that, but those other girls have to go out and get a job. And these yet other girls have to get married when they're 13 because the family can't support them. And that's what you do. Those are the customs. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces here, and if you're going to create opportunities for girls, you have to support those girls and families um, to make those opportunities more accessible, more possible, more equal, and a lot of that has to do with money. Wouldn't you agree, Bianca?
Well, you've caught me because I can't multitask, because I'm very honest about it as I was looking at other questions. So I do agree a lot has to do with money.
Yes, thank you.
But
all you needed to say. Yes, Margaret,
okay.
always right.
Good transit. Dangerous. That's dangerous. So this question here, I appreciate. There's a version of this. Okay. In The Edible Woman, you write, she was tired of being a manipulator of words. How did you manage to never get tired and continue to pursue your inspiring fights?
Oh, it's not that I never got tired. Yes, you can get tired, but then you can have a rest, and then you can go back at it. Or as people of my mother's generation used to say, roll up your sleeves, girls. Let's get it done, whatever it was. Yeah, so wonderful Ursula K. Le Guin on the subject of anger in her last book that she published, which was a book of essays. And one of the things she said about anger was it's a good motivator, but unless you then do the work, you're just going to be left with the anger, and that can get corrosive. Mm-hmm. So what part of the puzzle is making us angry? What needs to be changed? How do we change it like that? And how long will that take? Well, it could take quite a long time because, of course, you can change things and then somebody else changes them back. And we've just been through a cycle like that. So a couple of cycles. So 70s, a lot of changes were made. 80s, pushback. '89, the Cold War ends, and people aren't thinking about girls and women so much in that decade of the '90s. They're thinking about shopping. I was there. A lot of shopping went on. And then along comes 2001. 9/11 happens, then 2008 happens, then people start getting scared and angry, and there's another pushback which arrives in 2016. This is now 2021, and we're seeing things change again. So a lot of the pushback things that happened between 16 and 20 are now getting changed. But you've got to be prepared for the fact that just because you go forward in a direction that you think is positive, you can't count on other people agreeing with you about that. And you have to expect that there's going to be some attempt to change it back. That happens.
Yeah. And I think oh, there's more. Look, now questions are flying in here. Okay. I'm going to stop my follow-up. Have you ever been afraid to publish any of your works? And if so, what pushed you to do it anyway? And what were you afraid of, if you ever have been?
Well, I was apprehensive. I wouldn't say afraid. So when one of my old boyfriends was teaching me how to drive, he said, I actually can't teach you how to drive because you don't have enough fear. So I think I'm sort of negatively indexed for fear, Bianca. So I wouldn't call it fear. I would call it apprehension.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say with The Handmaid's Tale, some people are going to think I'm crazy. Other people are going to think I'm evil. Franchement, so what?
Mm.
No matter what you do, probably some people are going to think you're crazy and other people are going to think you're evil, but it depends on who those people are.
Have you been criticized for The Handmaid's Tale?
Did I what?
Did you get a lot of criticism?
Did I get a lot of criticism? Yes and no. So if you go back and read Mary McCarthy in the New York Times, she was not pleased. Partly because I think she believed in the yellow brick road, and a lot of people in those years, say the 70s and 80s, if you had proposed the, shall we say, totalitarian turn that gets taken in The Handmaid's Tale, they would have said, "Oh, that's impossible. That could never happen here. We are such a democracy. We are, exempt. Not happen here." And I did get a certain amount of that. I got in England jolly good yarn because they'd had their religious civil war. They had it in the 17th century. So they weren't about whatever else they were going to do. It wasn't going to be that. And remember, it was published before the Cold War had ended. And a lot of people in Europe idealized the United States. It was a beacon of light. It was democracy. That's what they wanted. It could never happen that such a democracy could take a turn towards authoritarianism, totalitarianism. But if you had been a student of American history from the beginning, you would know that the United States did not begin as a democracy. It began as a theocracy in the 17th century. And even when you get as far as the end of the 18th century and you have the American Revolution and you have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that's not democracy as we would now understand it, because there are a lot of people who were not included. And initially, it was only landowners who could male landowners who could vote. It wasn't women, and it certainly, oh, I should have said white, and it certainly wasn't Black people, and it certainly wasn't women. So the evolution of democracy in America has been step by step. When did women get the vote? When did women get the vote in France? Not until 1944. That's pretty far into the 20th century. So these things are pretty recent. Our idea that democracy should include everybody, that's a pretty recent development. And when there are recent developments like that people have decided, they could always decide the other way. And you are seeing right now a move in the United States to restrict voting rights. Mm-hmm. Are you not? Yes, you are. That's not democracy, folks.
Yeah, and I think so. I know we've got 5 minutes left, so just looking at some of the questions here, there's a lot of, no surprise, lots of them. But I think I'm gonna take one and shape it a little bit. But just as a white woman, right, myself, when I think about what I've lived through with diversity and inclusion, and when I think about women's rights, right, there has been some advancing there, but I think it has also, in some ways, for myself included, it's what's the structural piece of this that where the work continues by white women such as myself and should be a focus of, and I think that's sometimes where this categorization doesn't always help people understand, because yes, there was some progress in some of those times, but there were also major structural things that in terms of white supremacy that are just further entrenched now, and it's all it's
where you are. It depends what state you're in, for instance, what country you're in. So who's entrenching what where?
Right, but through these systems, I just think the reason I say it is because I think in 2021, I really adore this interview with James Baldwin, I think 1986 PBS documentary, and I can't deliver it like this, but I'd recommend anybody take a look at it, where he says, how much time do you want for your progress? And I think it's such an important question, because to this point about, on anger and urgency, but also knowing there's long-term work, we need to be honest about what is not done yet and what never got done, right? What never got done through even like public works deals. And, there was a lot of things that were not addressed properly all the way through. So not to say that there wasn't progress, but we need to make sure that this urgency and anger balance and this long-term work, for me, this is the question, is staying angry enough to work on it every day, but also you can't burn yourself out.
I don't think you have to be angry to do this stuff.
Well, that's good.
To be angry. I think you can just be resolute. You don't have to be angry all the time. That would be exhausting.
Yeah.
I don't do anger very well, so.
That's good. That's good. We all do. But
anger.
But you know what? I do think it's interesting as well, being in our bodies and understanding that some things you viscerally feel injustice sometimes, and I think it's good to be able to listen to that, right? Like it's this mix of up here and in here.
But even if you don't feel it, just a reasonable person can look at that and say, this isn't fair.
Yes, but I think it's disappointing me how many people should have seen that by now and don't seem to be moving. So I'm like, maybe there should be a physical jolt.
Who are these people?
Oh, they're all over the place, myself included. Like it's a struggle. It's a struggle. I just think I really feel, and looking at the time, I know we're going to have to wrap up very shortly. Just how much, say, the Canadian truth and reconciliation, how good we have to be about truth in order to move into reconciliation.
Right. Okay, so there's a very good book, and here's the book recommendation. Lewis Hyde he's the guy who wrote The Gift, which is very good on the subject of who are you as an artist. But he's got one on memory and forgetting. And it is absolutely true that you can't have forgetting unless you first have had remembering. So the truth of which you speak is remembering things that have happened that we were, in a lot of cases, never told, but those things have to go back and be remembered and learned before you can actually deal with them. So there's a reason why it says truth and reconciliation. There can't be reconciliation without truth first.
So I think
I'll just quote Orwell to you. 3 words. Tell the truth. Often hard to do, especially when the truth is sort of hazy or buried or concealed, or then you have to dig it up. but tell the truth insofar as it is possible.
I don't think there are better words to end on than those, honestly. Thank you for those words on a close. It's not easy, right? Like having conversations where there is challenge and dissent is part of democracy. And I'm just so grateful that we had the chance to have some of these conversations today together, and really appreciate the opportunity and the sharing of time and thought and history and memories. And if there's nothing else, perhaps this would be a good moment to, I'll say, do whatever we want to do in our screens as we part ways. But thank you so much for the time and the conversation. Thank you, and thank you.
Merci, Madame l'ambassadrice. C'était un grand plaisir pour moi et j'espère pour vous aussi.
Merci beaucoup, Margaret, Atwood. On a passé un formidable moment et j'espère qu'une chose, c'est qu'on pourra vous accueillir en personne très bientôt à l'ambassade pour poursuivre cette conversation. Un immense merci et passez une très bonne fin de semaine. Au revoir et merci, Bianca.
Au revoir,
Merci.
Madame.
Au revoir.
Bianca.
Merci. Au revoir.